Hello everyone. Tonight we step into the darkest corner of the Middle Ages, a place where purity could save a family's reputation, but couldn't save a girl's life. This isn't a fairy tale with princesses and knights. It's the raw truth about virginity, control, and enforced silence. And if you think being obedient would keep you safe, brace yourself, because even if you did nothing wrong, you could still be burned alive. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I share. And leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some background noise, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we're not starting with wars, bloodshed on battlefields, or knights in shining armor charging for noble ideals. Tonight, the prisoner isn't a criminal. It's a 15-year-old girl locked in an iron belt with a hole, not because she committed a crime, but because she hit puberty. We're going to talk about virginity, not the purity of legends, but a system of control, a prison without walls, a psychological wound legalized by sermons. Did you think virginity was a choice? In the Middle Ages, it was a condition for survival, a test to determine if you deserved to eat, to marry, to exist, or be deemed worthless. And the worst part, no one really knew what purity meant. They only knew one thing: if you didn't have it, or if someone said you didn't, you'd be burned, shunned, or stoned to death. So, before you imagine an era of elegant ladies in lace dresses and headscarves, picture waking up every morning knowing your body is a trap. Every movement, glance, or laugh could be used as evidence against you. And that chastity belt you've heard about in gruesome history tales, it was real, and it wasn't romantic. It was cold metal against flesh, a societal declaration: we don't trust you, so we lock you up. And when someone asked why you needed to stay chaste, the answer was never about you. It was always about your father, your husband, your family, or some blind deity. So, if you want to hear about the Middle Ages as an era of faith, morality, and lofty femininity, you should turn off this video. But if you're ready to face the truth, that virginity was a double-edged blade, sharpened by fear, hypocrisy, and power, then please, stay. Because tonight's story isn't for the faint of heart. It's for those who want to know how an entire woman's life in the Middle Ages, from puberty to burial, was tightly controlled by a concept invented by others. That concept was called virtue. But virtue back then wasn't kindness, patience, or selflessness. No, virtue was an invisible cage wrapped around your womanhood. And the irony, that cage was designed, built, and enforced by people who never had to uphold it. Have you ever seen a man executed for losing his virginity? Or a knight called dirty for sleeping with 3 serving girls in a week? No. Instead, he was seen as valiant. But if a girl was seen stepping out of her house a bit too quickly, she was no longer pure. The moral standards of the Middle Ages were a one-way weapon, aimed only at women, woven from the Bible, preached by men in white robes, and enforced by families, villages, courts, sometimes even your best friend. Virtue became the measure of worth. A good girl was one without desire, who didn't know love, didn't speak loudly, didn't laugh out loud, didn't go out unaccompanied. A good girl had chastity embroidered on her pillow, stayed demure, never argued, and if forced into marriage, bowed her head and accepted it. But you know what? The injustice didn't stop there. Worse still, this so-called virtue had no clear definition. It changed from village to village, class to class, husband to husband. Today you're good, tomorrow you're tainted. All it took was someone deciding so, and usually that someone had a beard, power, and bloodstains on their sleeve from the last time they beat their wife. They said virtue was to protect women, but in reality, it was a way to strip power from women. Because once your worth was tied to being untouched, everything else you did, your talents, courage, kindness, meant nothing if someone tainted you. And if you were raped, it was still your fault, because you didn't protect yourself well enough, because you went out at dusk, because you didn't bring your mother, because you forgot to tie your dress, because you breathed, because you existed. That wasn't morality. It was punishment cloaked in morality. In the Middle Ages, a woman could be buried alive for not screaming during assault, or forced to drink her late husband's ashes for being suspected of carrying his soul, or have her head shaved, be put in stocks, and paraded through town just for being rumored to fancy. The flute player at the fair. All those punishments were in the name of protecting moral standards. But no one asked, where did those standards come from? No council of women created them. No woman sat down and said, we should control ourselves until we die of pain and shame. No, those standards were set by clergy, reinforced by lords, and perpetuated through generations by fear. Women taught their daughters to stay silent, not because they believed in it, but because they knew if their daughters spoke out, they'd be punished. And gradually, we started believing in the chains, as if they were part of our bodies, like a bird caged from birth. Fears flying, medieval women feared themselves. They feared emotions, feared arousal, feared glances, feared the stirring in their chests. They feared their wedding night not bleeding, because they knew no blood meant no proof meant no trust, and no trust meant no life. When every standard is built on distrust, love is just a sanctioned version of possession. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. Men could err, women couldn't have instincts. Men could remarry 10 times. A woman without a husband was a danger. A man who cheated was foolish. A woman pregnant with an unknown father was vile, and her child, spawn of the devil. That was a world where virtue wasn't a quality, it was a noose, something you had to wear around your neck every day, while others watched, nodded, and called you noble. But then you'd ask, is there a way to keep it? The answer is no, because it wasn't something you could keep. It was an unattainable standard, designed to make you always fail. And because you failed, others had a reason to control you forever. You couldn't win a game rigged for you to lose. And that's why, from girlhood, every woman understood, staying pure wasn't for a better life. It was to survive. But surviving for how long, and how, that's another story. And we'll talk about where virginity stopped being a metaphor and became a real bloodstain on a white cloth. If it didn't appear after the first night, you might not get another chance to prove you deserved to live. But sometimes, you didn't even need to reach the wedding night to be condemned. Just one moment. A glance. A slight smile. A breath out of sync between 2 church bells. And that was it. You were a harlot. No inspection. No questioning. No evidence needed. Your honor was decided by someone sitting 3 tables away at the spring feast. Someone who drank too much cider. Someone you rejected 2 harvests ago. Or simply, someone whose wife didn't like your face. Virginity, as you've seen, was something protected, preached, and enforced. But there was something even scarier than losing it, being accused of having lost it. And in the Middle Ages, to be labeled as lost, you didn't need to do much. A girl smiling at a merchant from another village, harlot. A widow responding too warmly to a guard, harlot. A young woman wearing a slightly thinner dress in summer, harlot. The accusation didn't come from actions, it came from the feelings of the onlooker. If they thought you seemed too loose, you were a target. And that feeling, you couldn't control it. No one taught you how to look without being seductive. No one showed you how to walk without swaying. No one told you what to do with your face when the weather was nice, and you genuinely wanted to smile, but you'd pay for every move. Because once you were branded immodest, it clung to you like the smell of smoke after a day by the hearth, persistent, hard to wash off, always hinting at something smoldering inside. In that era, reputation wasn't something you built, it was something you defended. Every day was a silent trial. The judges were your neighbors, the messenger, the baker, sometimes the village dog growling at you too long, and you weren't allowed to err, because once you did, or seemed to, you'd never be forgiven. The medieval crowd didn't need truth, they needed feelings. The feeling that you were different, unusual, not like their mother, sister, or the cow they raised from a calf. And difference, in a society built on conformity, was a declaration of war. A young woman was once branded wanton, just for talking too long with a soldier. They sat by a well, in broad daylight, discussing horse reins. 3 days later, she was dragged to the market, hands bound, dress torn, and her head dunked in mud, to cleanse her. The soldier marched on. She lost her voice, her betrothed, and her name. People just called her that girl from then on. She in a system where femininity was defined by silence, submission, and blandness. Any sign of life, a smile, a glance, a voice, was seen as provocation. You were cheerful, lewd, intelligent, scheming, argumentative, insolent, silent, secretly wanton. No choice was safe. Every path led to one outcome. You were blamed, and others got to speak for you. That's what made the virginity standard not just cruel, but impossible. Because you couldn't control something decided by others' feelings. And that's exactly why it was the perfect tool for control. When you couldn't clear your name, you wouldn't dare do anything. You'd bow, shrink, curl into yourself until you became a shadow. You learned not to react, not to talk, not to pause on the road, even if you saw someone being beaten. You learned to swallow your laughter, keep your hands in front of you and eyes down, so no one could say you were tempting men. But even if you did everything right, you could still be labeled because people didn't need truth to stone you. They just needed a reason to feel right. And you, the woman who didn't smile correctly, were always the easiest excuse. One thing history books often overlook is how an entire society claimed the right to control a woman's simplest joy, her smile. In a world where every punishment was veiled in prayer, where humiliation was called discipline, smiling became rebellion. And you know what's most terrifying? Eventually, you believed them. You started fearing your own face in the mirror. You asked yourself, was I too cheerful today? You saw a stranger staring back and instantly felt guilty. You avoided mirrors, people, yourself. That's when they won. No fire, no rope needed. Just plant fear in every muscle of your face, and you'd lock yourself in the cage called virtue, so they wouldn't have to do it for you. But don't think that's the end, because after the smile came the dress. After the dress, the bed. After the bed, the white cloth, waiting for blood. And if no blood came that night, you'd bleed another morning, in another way. We'll step into where the marriage ceremony wasn't just a vow, but a life or death trial of the body, where a red stain could save you, or kill you more slowly. But before the bed, before the wedding night, before the white cloth waiting for blood, there was something smaller, thinner, lighter, but carrying the weight of an entire moral system. Hair. Yes, a single strand falling from your head covering could be seen as a sign of lust. A lock of hair on your forehead could silently declare you were no longer chaste. Hair in the Middle Ages wasn't just part of the body, it was a verdict. It was interpreted, controlled, punished, as if it were physical evidence of your inner self. If you let it down, you were inviting. If you braided it neatly, you were good. If you covered it completely, you were humble. But if you were forced to shave it, you'd sinned, were atoning, or worst, you had nothing left to protect. People could look at your hair and decide if you deserved forgiveness. A widow too young who didn't shave her head, unfaithful. A young girl with naturally curly hair, somewhat loose. A wife with hair dyed with rosemary, definitely a witch. Every strand was a message, and sadly, you didn't get to choose the message. Long hair was a symbol of femininity, but only if it was tied tightly, pressed against your skull, as if joy was strangled with every lock. Little girls were taught to braid from age 3, not for beauty, but to get used to control. Every strand out of place was a sign of moral neglect. And if you let your hair down in church, you just insulted God. No further explanation needed. You were blacklisted. A young woman was once punished just for attending her cousin's wedding, without a headscarf. She said she forgot. They said, liar. A week later, she was pelted with rotten eggs at the market. A month later, she was kicked out of her home. It all started with a loose lock of hair. But the irony, hair too beautiful, wasn't allowed either. Too silky, you were seductive. Too shiny, you brushed and washed to lure men. Too voluminous, you were suspected of witchcraft. The more you cared for your hair, the more reasons they had to condemn you. And if you didn't care, you were slovenly, unfeminine, unworthy of attention. This game had no winning path. That's why many women, caught in the moral crosshairs, chose to shave their heads. Not because they wanted atonement, but because they were exhausted from their hair being turned into an indictment. One woman once said, I cut my hair not because I was wrong, but because I didn't want anyone else talking about it. You might think this is unimaginable, but consider, have you ever been judged for messy hair, called sloppy, too flashy, unrefined, just for a hairstyle? Now multiply that by 100. Place it in a society where a woman's laugh was lewd, her glance an invitation, her hair evidence of uncommitted sin. That was the Middle Ages. And in that world, they didn't need to touch you to control you. They just needed to look at your hair. Judgment would follow. That judgment didn't come from the priest's mouth, but from the way the neighbor woman stared from her window, from the giggles of children as you passed by, from the whispers of wives when their husbands glanced at you for 2 seconds. The system was so effective, you policed yourself better than any law could. And when shaving your head became a punishment, keeping your hair became a burden. You lived between extremes, hide everything as if you didn't exist, or accept punishment for daring to be yourself. There was no middle ground, no flexibility, no room for personality. Just a comb, a tie, and trembling hands every morning, afraid of braiding wrong. And don't think men didn't know this. They knew full well. They exploited it. A man wanting to humiliate you didn't need to hit you. He just had to tell someone. She let her hair down at the well yesterday, and that was it. The village took care of the rest. A child once asked her mother, "Why can't I have long hair like the fairy in the story?" Her mother replied, "Because we don't live in stories. In fairy tales, hair was a ladder for a prince to climb. In life, hair was a noose." We'll dive into the most terrifying moment, the first night, when virginity stopped being a sermon and became blood, cloth, evidence. When your entire life hinged on a red stain. If it wasn't there, you might not be allowed to stay. You let down your hair. Now it's time to let blood. And that blood wasn't yours to choose, because the medieval wedding night wasn't about love. It was an inspection, a test of human worth through the body, through a white cloth, through something called proof of virtue. But, let's be clear, it wasn't virtue. It was a commodity. And virginity, the thing praised, worshipped, revered as something sacred, was really just a form of property bought and sold with blood, screams, and contracts. They didn't demand you stay chaste for morality. They demanded it for profit. Virginity, at its core, was what made men feel they'd bought an unopened product. It was what families used as leverage in negotiations. A gift from father to son-in-law, a card a mother held to secure a good match for her daughter, and the only thing a girl owned that she could never use as she wished. You could live in a poor village, eat spoiled porridge, sleep on rotten straw, but if you were still pure, you were valuable property. Virginity became a bizarre currency, invisible but convertible into weddings, sheep, land, alliances between families. It wasn't written in contracts, but everyone knew it was part of every deal. And if you lost it, whether by choice or by force, every value tied to it vanished too. A raped girl wasn't comforted. She was seen as damaged goods. A widowed woman tricked into affection was despised by the village. An orphaned child assaulted was no longer marriageable. In those stories, the perpetrator vanished. Only the victim bore the stain. And that's the most terrifying part. They didn't care what happened. They only cared that you were no longer intact. Because when virginity was property, you had 2 choices: keep it until the right person took it, or lose it, and lose any chance at a decent life. You couldn't give it away unless someone allowed it, and if you dared give it freely, even in love, you were still betraying family honor. No one cared how long you loved him. No one asked if he loved you truly. All they needed to know was who took it first. And if it wasn't the man your father chose, you were as good as dead. The medieval moral system used virginity as a silent weapon. It made women compete in silence, made mothers teach daughters to avoid men instead of understand them, made men think they had the right to take, if they'd paid with a wedding, dowry, promise, or even a returned glance. And then, women began judging each other through that lens. She stared at those soldiers too long. That girl hums while bathing. Probably not pure. Whispers like hidden knives. Not loud enough to hear clearly, but sharp enough to cut you into still pure, or lost. No one asked, "It's your virginity. Do you want to keep it?" No one asked if it's stolen. "Can you reclaim your worth?" No one asked, "Why is the one thing you own the one thing you can't control?" And this wasn't just true for peasants. In noble families, virginity was written into marriage contracts. Mothers watched daughters more closely than guards. Young ladies lived in private rooms, watched 24/7, just to ensure the prize wasn't taken before the right moment. But what no one admitted was, sometimes, the one taking was a father, uncle, or grandfather in the household. And then, silence, because family honor mattered more than the victims. Virginity then wasn't something to give, it was something to hide, to blame, to use as a weapon in arguments, or worse, to bargain with God. I'll offer my daughter to you. If this year's harvest is good, I'll stay chaste until I die, if you spare my father from illness. And so, it went from traded goods to sacrificial offering. A virgin girl, suddenly chosen as a sacrifice for rain, crops, peace, not because she was special, but because she was untouched. That's it. And then, they'd weep when she died. Weep for lost beauty. Weep for injustice. But the truth? They weren't weeping for her. They wept for the property they could no longer keep. And when that property was gone, they moved on to find another, a sister, a niece, a 12-year-old girl who seemed obedient. The cycle continued, because when you weren't allowed to own your body, no part of you was truly yours, not even the thing they told you to guard most. And you know what's most heartbreaking? Sometimes, you believed it too. You guarded it. You protected it. You hated your body for fear it might slip out of control. You feared dreaming of someone, feared shivering at a deep laugh, feared your breasts growing too fast, feared your hips being softer than your mother's. You lived in fear to protect something you weren't allowed to use. And then one day, you gave it away, or it was taken, and you realized all those years of fear bought you nothing. No one thanked you. No one protected you back. No one stood by you when you needed it. Just one cold question, repeated endlessly. Why did you lose it? You'll see what happened when a girl lost it. She didn't die right away, but her honor did. And honor, in that era, was the only way to keep your life. But the irony is, your honor wasn't something you created. It was given, taken, negotiated, and trampled by others. And sometimes, it was decided on the day you wore your wedding dress, even if you were only 14, even if you didn't fully understand the whispers of adults behind your back, even if you'd only had your first period 3 months ago, and hadn't yet asked your mother why they called it a curse. All you knew was today, you're a bride, and your mother is crying, not out of joy, not out of pride, but because she knows you're about to step into a cage, not made of iron but of expectations, duties, and total control. You look at her and don't understand why her eyes hold more pain than when she buried your father last year. You thought a wedding day was supposed to be happy, but no one told you that becoming a wife meant losing your body, your freedom, and your childhood in a single moment. The white dress on you isn't a dreamy garment. It's a veil hiding the truth, a living receipt, proving you've kept yourself. A shell to make people temporarily believe you've never erred. But deep in your heart, you're scared, not of the first night, but of doing something wrong, that the blood won't flow, that the bedsheet will stay clean, that your husband, 20 years older, with calloused hands and the smell of wine on his breath, will be furious, that your mother-in-law will look at you like you're a sacrifice that didn't meet the standard. You fear being returned like a defective item, because that's what happened to your cousin. She was sent back after 3 days, no one saying why, and no one married her after that. She lived in a small room behind the stable, no one calling her name, no one checking on her, just an old cat, and eyes that always seemed to be waiting for death. You don't want to end up like that, so you stay silent, bow your head, accept the ceremony, bite your lip when a stranger places a flower crown on your hair, pulls you onto a horse, and takes you away from home, away from your mother, your little sister, the vegetable garden, where you used to play as a child. You don't cry, but your mother does. She doesn't hug you long, because if she did, she'd scream, and a bride screaming on her wedding day is a bad omen. So she only touches your shoulder lightly, then turns away, and you're pulled along like a living dowry. No one asks if you want this, because they don't believe a 14-year-old girl has the right to want. They just need you to be good, to not react, to not talk to strangers, to not ask, what will happen tonight? You sit on the wedding bed, hearing your husband talking with guests downstairs. Laughter echoes, glasses clink, heavy footsteps shuffle. You don't understand everything they say, but one sentence is clear. Definitely brand new merchandise. They laugh. You feel a chill down your spine. You touch your dress, stiff, rough fabric, nothing like any dream you ever had. You don't dare look at the white cloth spread on the bed. It feels like a verdict waiting to be signed. And you're the one signing it, with blood, with pain, with the tearing of a part of you that you never understood. No one told you how much it would hurt. No one said you could cry, scream, or tremble. They only warned, don't shame the family. Your mother-in-law instructed, if there's blood, fold the cloth and bring it to the kitchen. Don't let the servants see it first. She said this while handing you a bundle of dried basil, not to eat, but to apply afterward, to reduce the swelling. You didn't ask why you'd need it, because if you did, they'd call you insolent. Your mind is a fog of fear, shame, and confusion about why everyone says, keep yourself until your wedding day, but on that day, no one protects you anymore. And you start to understand why your mother cried. She went through the same thing. She wore the stiff dress, sat in a strange room, trembled at the sound of a man's footsteps approaching, and she knew from that moment everything you were would no longer be yours. You're no longer your mother's daughter, no longer the giggling child playing with a cat, no longer someone hugged, asked about, or allowed to choose what brings you joy. You become a wife, and a wife in this era is a shell that works, bears children, and stays silent when beaten, as long as you can give birth. If you can't, you're useless. If you bear daughters, you're blamed for not praying right. And if you tarnish your husband's family honor, even by laughing at the wrong time, you're labeled filthy. At 14, you don't fully grasp this, but you feel it. In every glance, every tight grip on your hand, in the gruff voice of your new husband, in the coldness of your mother-in-law, on the first night. You understand from now on, you can't err, you can't complain, you can't dream. You're not a princess. Your property delivered on time. And if you survive the first night, congratulations, you get to endure for decades more. When a bloodless bedsheet becomes evidence of guilt, when no one stands by you, except your own trembling back in the dark, and when, to be deemed decent, you must bleed, even though your soul shattered long before. Because the medieval wedding night wasn't a beginning, it was a test, a secret trial with no judge, no lawyer, just you, that man, and a white cloth spread like an executioner's table. It wasn't a place for love, no gentle candlelight, no consensual glances, no whispers of do you want this. It was where your family's honor hung by a thread of blood, where your body was dissected into physical evidence. Was your moan the right kind, your sob appropriate, and above all, did the blood appear? If it did, you were pure. If not, you were a traitor. And explanations weren't allowed. You couldn't say you fell down the stairs at 10, that a relative did something unspeakable, that your body just didn't bleed. No one listened. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about the bedsheet, because that sheet, or rather the blood on it, was the only certificate of your worth. Some families kept that cloth for life, folded neatly, stored in a wooden chest, like an heirloom. Some villages displayed it publicly, hung at the gate, in front of a crowd, to proclaim, our bride is still a virgin. People clapped, laughed, congratulated. But no one asked, is she okay? No one looked into her eyes. No one considered whether what happened last night was consensual. The only thing that mattered was there blood? Sometimes, that blood wasn't from tearing. It came from nails digging into palms, teeth biting lips until they bled, scratches deliberately made with an iron comb. Some girls knew this. They prepared in secret. Some mixed chicken blood. Some pricked their fingers. Some hid a small pouch of red liquid under the cloth. They weren't deceitful. They were defending themselves. Because without that blood stain, there was nothing left to protect. Some brides were beaten that night for not bleeding, dragged to the courtyard, dress torn, eyes bruised, with the mother-in-law screaming, "You're used goods." Some were sent back to their mother's house, no questions asked. Some were brought to village courts, forced to kneel and name the second man. Some, simpler still, were locked in animal pens for 3 days, like a beast needing taming, all because there was no blood. And even if you bled, you weren't safe. They could say, the blood isn't fresh, not enough, not spread right, in the wrong spot, because this wasn't a medical exam. It was a subjective trial, where evidence was cherry-picked by prejudice, and the verdict was written beforehand. That's why women then feared the first night, not for the pain, but for the judgment, for the silence that stretched through the next morning, for the mother-in-law's scrutinizing eyes, for the servants' whispers as they brought porridge, for the slow knock on the door, then the loaded question, everything all right? But all right didn't mean feelings, not happiness, not love. It meant, did the blood flow? Was it enough? Was it right? And if everything was all right, you could keep living, not living joyfully, but living with enough worth to be bound to the next duties, wife, mother, slave. If it wasn't all right, every door closed, you'd forever be a stain. Never again, respectable. Even if you did nothing wrong, even if it was your first time, even if your body just didn't do what they wanted, in the way they defined. Some girls never smiled again after that night. Some lost sleep for months, reliving the moment he tore their dress, pinned them down, whispered, "Don't fight," while downstairs, everyone waited for blood, like they waited for wedding cake. Some went to the well, not for water, but to end it all, and it all stemmed from a bedsheet. A lifeless piece of cloth, given the power to decide a person's worth. You didn't need to love, understand, or consent, you just needed to bleed, and when you bled, you were called virtuous. But have you ever seen a moral concept that required physical harm to prove? If pain is the price of respect, that respect is cheap. And if blood is the only proof of purity, this world rotted long ago, because after the bed came the pulpit, and from that pulpit, they'd teach you how to never be yourself again. They wore long robes, clutched Bibles, their voices booming, as if chosen by God to represent truth. But when their eyes grazed your neck, lingered on your hem, or frowned slightly at hair slipping from your headscarf, you realized something, that look wasn't God's. It was the gaze of a man judging you, not by spirituality, but by a moral standard warped to the bone. Because in the medieval church, you weren't a believer. You were a threat. A female body, however small, fragile, trembling, was still a seed of sin. They said the first woman led humanity into sin, so every woman after carried the mark of betrayal. You couldn't look up, couldn't smile, couldn't kneel too close to the altar if unmarried, and you absolutely couldn't confess to a priest in too soft a voice, because that could be interpreted as seductive. This priest banned all women under 20 from morning mass, because sunlight on them made it hard for the monks to stay pure. That statement didn't spark outrage, it sparked compliance. No one asked why, no one objected, because they believed if you caused a man to falter, you were to blame. Sin in the Middle Ages wasn't in actions, it was in existence. Being a woman meant you were inherently guilty. You had to restrain yourself, hide your appearance, diminish your presence, walk lightly, speak softly, never look too long into any monk's eyes, because if a priest erred, it must be because you tempted him. So when they preached that the body was filthy, that desire led to hell, that women were fragile vessels full of temptation, you didn't argue. You bowed, pulled your scarf higher, and told yourself, maybe I really am the problem. In church you heard about the purity of Mother Mary, but were taught to hate your belly, your breasts, even your own dreams at night. No one said you could love your body. They told you to fight it. You learned to see natural things as diseases. Menstruation was Eve's blood. Breasts were unnecessary excess. Curved hips were a sign of sin. Wide hips were a mark of childbirth, and childbirth was punishment for the fall. You stopped looking in the mirror, because every curve felt like evidence against you. And when you went to church, you didn't pray anymore. You feared being seen, feared being criticized, feared your footsteps echoing too loudly in the sanctuary, feared your voice singing hymns too high, too vibrant. One girl was punished for singing too emotionally. The priest said her voice distracted the blacksmith. No one asked why the fault wasn't the blacksmith's. No one asked why emotion was a sin. They only asked, why did she sing like that? And she was made to kneel in the church courtyard for 3 days, 3 hours each day, to learn silence. In that environment, every confession wasn't about what you did wrong. It was about what you thought made others err. I showed my ankle. I thought about his hand. I dreamed of being touched. Those words were seen as honest repentance. The priest nodded, gave you a few prayers, but never true forgiveness, because the goal wasn't to absolve you. It was to ensure you never forgot you were the sin. And when you believed that long enough, you wouldn't dare love anyone, wouldn't trust anyone to love you, wouldn't dare dream, wouldn't dare live authentically. You lived in self-censorship, where you became the guard of your own body. They didn't need prisons. They didn't need shackles. They just needed a pulpit and enough sermons to make you imprison yourself for life. And the priest, with eyes that didn't touch your skin but pierced your mind, would remind you weakly, you are guilty. Your body is guilty. The way you sit could be guilty. They used beautiful words, humility, discipline, purity, but they were masks. Behind them was contempt, surveillance, a desire for control. One priest said, women must guard themselves, not for God, but for men's weakness. And no one saw a problem with that. They called it hard truth. But why were you responsible for someone else's weakness? Why were you punished for a glance you didn't control? Why did the priest, God's representative, look at you like you were a small serpent slithering around the pulpit, waiting to bite anyone who didn't look away fast enough? The answer is simple. They feared you. They feared the power you didn't know you had. They feared the life in you, something they couldn't mold, lock, or fully control, unless they made you believe it was a monster. And once you believed, you'd never dare free yourself again. Not silence out of submission, but silence out of fear. Because if you spoke the truth, you could lose everything. But if you stayed silent, you could keep one thing, the right to exist. Even if only in the shadows, an existence so small, cautious, quiet, that you began to doubt, am I really alive, or just waiting for someone to let me breathe? And then you realized, silence wasn't a choice. It was the only thing you were allowed to carry in this life. In the medieval world, women were taught to be silent from the moment they could speak, not to listen better, but to not disturb, to not provoke, to not draw attention, to not bring trouble on themselves. The quieter you were, the more virtuous you were seen. The less you spoke, the less you were accused, the less you showed emotion, the less you were called a witch, a whore, a seed of disaster. You couldn't argue with your husband, couldn't ask your father about marriage plans, couldn't complain to your mother about the wedding night, couldn't tell anyone you were in pain. And if someone touched you in the forest, the fields, the kitchen, you absolutely couldn't speak. Because if you did, you'd be questioned. What were you wearing? Where were you going? How did you look at him? Did you scream? Did you fight? And if there was no blood, no witnesses, no cry, you were the guilty one. No one needed to know what really happened. Just speaking out broke the order. And that order wasn't justice. It was a fragile peace built on collective fear. In one village, a girl named Annalise dared point at the tax collector and say he touched her in the storeroom. No one defended her. 3 days later, they poured oil on her dress, tied her to a stake, and called her a witch. Not because she lied, but because she spoke too loudly. She was burned. The villagers whispered, why didn't she keep her mouth shut? From then on, every girl learned survival meant silence. Someone asked, why didn't medieval women rebel? Rise up, run away from that brutal system? The answer is simple, because they couldn't trust their own voices. Every time they thought of speaking, they remembered their mother's eyes, their cousin shamed in public, the neighbor hanged for being provocative, and they swallowed their words, buried them in their chests, slowly forgot what they wanted to say. It was silent training, through glances, teachings, sayings like guiding stars. Girls must watch their tongues, speak less, so people will like you. Arguing is bad manners. If you're touched, don't make a fuss. You grew up with those words. Eventually, you didn't need reminding. You stayed silent on your own, felt guilty for wanting to speak, feared naming someone who wronged you. Silence became reflex, like a fledgling not singing near a hunter's trap, like a doe teaching her fawn to freeze at strange sounds. You learned to dodge, to fake a smile, to pretend not to hear lewd comments, to ignore a hand placed wrong, to act like you didn't hear your husband call another woman's name in his drunken stupor. Silence was how you survived, the only armor you had, but it was also what choked you every day. It made you feel smaller, invisible, unimportant, not enough. And the most painful part, it made you think you deserved what happened. Someone said, silence is golden. But in the Middle Ages, silence was a slow death. watching the wicked live in peace while you, the victim, were forgotten, doubted, condemned. Silence wasn't a moral choice. It was the only choice left after every other was burned, drowned, or buried alive with someone's name you were never allowed to speak. And you know what made it crueler? You were forced to smile in that silence, to seem agreeable, to endure with grace, because if you snapped, got angry, screamed, you'd be called mad, ruined, unmarriageable. Your anger was labeled disorder, your sadness, selfishness. You couldn't hurt authentically, you could only suffer quietly, silently, retreat to a dark corner without bothering anyone. You were a shadow, and shadows don't have voices. But every darkness has a limit. At some point, you'd want to speak, to scream, to name the one who touched you, forced you, taught you love was possession. And then, you'd stand at a crossroads, speak and lose everything, or stay silent and lose yourself. Because in that world, a single lie could turn you to ash, without any proof. And the cruelest part, sometimes, you didn't even need slander. You just needed to smile. A smile, seemingly harmless. The last flicker of light you held in your heart could be twisted into a verdict. In the Middle Ages, white teeth were a sign of wantonness. Yes, you heard that right. If your teeth were even and bright, it meant you smiled too much, and women who smiled too much were loose. Women with desires, women who surely did filthy things. In a society where appearances were scrutinized, harsher than criminals, white teeth meant you risked being seen as the devil's tool. From childhood, you were taught to smile softly, lips half closed, hand covering your mouth, when happy, never showing teeth when joking. Laughing loudly, especially out loud, was crude, tasteless, shameless. No one told you laughing was happiness. They only warned girls who show their teeth aren't proper. Then you looked around and saw women who smiled faintly, lived in peace. But those who laughed loudly, where did they go? One was cast out for flirtatious behavior, another branded a witch for being oddly cheerful, another just for laughing, while talking to a man, was forced to marry an old man in 3 days, as punishment for her brazenness. You learned to swallow your laughter, to keep it from bursting out, to not let anyone see you could be happy, to not let the light in you slip through your lips, because if you smiled at the wrong time, wrong place, wrong person, you were inviting evil. Every facial expression could be a reason for the village to judge you. Do you know what's most heartbreaking? They didn't need to hate you, they just needed to doubt you. Doubt you were too radiant, doubt you were confident, doubt you dared smile when you should have stayed meek, and that was enough. Some women were accused of using charms just for white teeth. The young girl was interrogated for smiling naively at a guard, though she was only asking to pass the village gate. Another was forced to drink ash water for laughing improperly at a funeral. Those punishments weren't to teach you to smile right. They were to make you fear happiness, because a happy woman was hard to control. She'd dare speak, dare love, dare leave, authentically, and that system couldn't allow it. So they broke your laughter first, turned joy into danger, and when you learned that every laugh put you at risk, you stopped laughing, stopped being natural, stopped being carefree, stopped existing as a full human, with emotions. You smiled politely, smiled with fake creases, smiled to survive, but never because you were truly happy. And one day, you looked in the mirror and saw your lips curve strangely. You asked yourself, what am I doing? Who's controlling my face? You didn't recognize yourself anymore, because you'd adjusted to every frown of society until you no longer knew who you were. They didn't need to silence your voice. They just needed to make you fear, smiling, and if you couldn't smile, were you still you? That question, you didn't dare answer, because answering meant facing it, and facing it meant rebellion, and rebellion, you knew the outcome, because after the smile comes the confession, and once you start speaking, you'll never be forgiven. Not because you're wrong, but because in that world, a woman's honesty was never encouraged. They didn't need your sincerity, they only needed your submission. They didn't care how you felt, they just needed you to be silent, keep order, and never trouble anyone with your existence. In the Middle Ages, women weren't allowed to be tired. No one asked if you slept enough. No one asked if you had a headache last night, if you were short of breath, if you felt cold from the draft through the mud walls, every morning you had to rise before everyone else. Tend to the kitchen, light the fire, fetch water, wash clothes, care for the children, the husband, the mother-in-law, and if you had time, tend to your soul with a few repeated prayers, like a worn-out millstone. You had no days off, no personal time, no moment to relax your body without fear of being caught and mocked as lazy. Because if you complained of exhaustion, someone would say, "My mother birthed 7 children and still worked the fields." If you mentioned back pain, they'd retort, "Don't you know women are born to endure?" If you said you needed a break, they'd look at you like you'd insulted their entire lineage. So you didn't dare be tired, didn't dare sigh, didn't dare sit longer than necessary. And if you collapsed on the ground, face buried in your hands from sheer exhaustion, someone would nudge your foot and say, "Stop the act, get up and work." Your fatigue was seen as a sign of depravity. A real woman never complained. A good wife always smiled, even when doubled over with menstrual cramps. A virtuous mother never grumbled after 3 sleepless nights, nursing a feverish child. You were fed an ideal: be obedient, gentle, enduring. And if your husband slapped you, ask yourself what dish you cooked wrong. Every time you got angry, you were wrong. Every time you were sad, you were weak. Every time you reacted, you were stubborn. So you learned to smile while hollow inside. Learn to set the table with numb hands. Learn to cook with tear-blurred eyes. Learn to say, "I'm fine," when you had no strength left to stand. Fatigue was a privilege, and women then had no privileges. You were a tool, the family's operator, a breeding machine, a mirror for the family's honor. If you stopped turning, the system would falter. So you weren't allowed to stop, weren't allowed to weaken, weren't allowed to be human. There was a woman, 29, who after birthing her 5th child was so exhausted she couldn't stand to cook porridge for her mother-in-law. The mother-in-law said, "A lazy daughter-in-law, not like when she first came here." 3 days later, she tied her hair to a beam. No one cried. Her husband only said she couldn't handle the responsibility. Think that story was rare? No, most women just chose to die slower. They ate less to cook less, hid their swollen feet under thick skirts, learned to kill every feeling inside, turning themselves into part of the house, no longer a living being with emotions. That's how you survived, by forgetting you had limits. And then you began to despise your own exhaustion, felt ashamed for wanting to give up, felt guilty for needing rest, felt flawed for wanting to scream, "I'm tired." You didn't dare cry, didn't dare sleep in, didn't dare ask for help, because in your head echoed the voices of other women. Push through the fatigue. You're a woman, after all. So you obeyed. You repeated their journey. You taught your daughter to obey too, taught her to work when tired, to smile when she wanted to cry, to never complain, never idle, never lose her manners. And so the chain of slavery continued, from one generation to the next, from wife to mother, from mother to daughter, until no one remembered women could once rest without permission. We'll step into an even crueler space, the birthing room, where you couldn't moan too loudly in pain, where life and death were one convulsion apart, and where, after it all, you were only praised as good if you gave birth without bothering anyone. Because even as blood poured between your legs, they'd still remind you, as a woman you must be good. But being good wasn't enough, never enough. You could endure pain, not complain, not react, not sigh, not speak loudly, not show your teeth when smiling, but one wrong glance, one displeasing word, one moment standing too close to the wrong man was enough to brand you a harlot. And the cruelest part, no proof was needed, no touch, no act, just one accusation, a whisper persistent enough, timed just right, and you were done. In the Middle Ages, a woman's reputation was more fragile than a thread, and anyone could cut it. The neighbor woman, the miller's daughter, a man you once rejected, a wife jealous because her husband glanced at you, a soldier who disliked how you bowed without trembling, a mother-in-law who didn't like the smell of your soap. Anyone could make you a topic, and from a topic, a verdict. You were called immodest for daring to look someone in the eye, provocative because your dress was thinner than their ideal, wanton because you went to the market alone. Everything you did could be twisted, misinterpreted, retold wrong. And once the accusation left someone's mouth, nothing could pull it back. You couldn't argue, because arguing meant defiance, and defiance meant insolence, and an insolent woman, surely no good. In that system, silence was your only remaining option. But ironically, silence was also admission. You didn't speak, they said. See, guilty conscience. You spoke, they said. Knew it. She's slippery. No escape. Once labeled a harlot, you were no longer a person. You were a symbol, a lesson, a mirror for others to point at and tell their daughters, don't be like her. A woman accused of debauchery once stood in the market, sobbing that she'd never touched anyone but her husband. They laughed. A soldier said, speaking so loud proves she's wanton. No one verified. No one asked. Who started the rumor? No one checked the truth. They only needed one thing, the feeling. You'd crossed a line, and that line was invisible, shifting with someone's mood. Today you went to the well in a dark cloak. Fine. Tomorrow, same cloak but looking happier. Harlot. You controlled nothing. And the truth is, you weren't allowed to control anything, because the real power was the ability to turn an innocent person into an outcast with just words. The one holding that power needed no evidence, just your silence and the crowd's fear. That's how society kept order, not with laws, but with the fear of being accused. And what's scarier, eventually, women learned to use slander as a weapon too, because when you couldn't protect yourself, the only way to survive was to drag someone else lower. A girl was rumored to have feelings for a monk. Her mother, instead of defending her, said, she must be troubled. She's always laughed strangely since childhood, and that was it. She was exiled from the village. No one took her in. No one married her. No one dared shelter her. She vanished. Just because someone saw her smile, and someone else didn't like it, think you could avoid it by being careful. No, some women were called too quiet, must be hiding something. Others, too gentle, must be plotting evil. Others too beautiful, can't possibly be virtuous. The more you tried to fit, the more they saw you as disguising something, because really no one wanted you to fit. They wanted you to fear so much you'd adjust yourself, shrink, mold yourself into impossible standards, so they wouldn't need to control you. You'd already do it yourself. And when you feared, you wouldn't dare live authentically, wouldn't dare live truly, or wouldn't dare dream truly. You'd give up everything, just to avoid one label, harlot. But that label was always waiting, like a knife over your head, and it would fall anytime anyone decided you were too noticeable, too different, or simply dislikable. We'll step into the real consequences of accusation, not just whispers, not just scornful glances, but a chain of punishments from physical to spiritual, where you were publicly shamed, punished with rituals, and most importantly, stripped of your name. Because once you were no longer called by your name, you were no longer a person, you were just it, and it could be subjected to anything. It could be dragged to the market for the village to curse, forced to shave its head as a form of cleansing, stripped of clothes to prove it had nothing left to hide. It could be pushed into the church, made to kneel and confess before a crowd, while people read the Bible louder than usual, as if God's voice would drown out the cries of a woman without a name. But the worst part, by then, you weren't even surprised, because long before you'd been taught to be ashamed of your own body, before you even knew how to use it, before you knew wrists were for holding, breasts for nursing, hips for bearing life's weight, you knew to hide them, to cover, to shrink, to avoid, to be ashamed, because a woman's body, in the Middle Ages, wasn't natural. It was a threat, the source of all sin, living proof of the weak nature of the species that bit the forbidden fruit. You weren't taught your body was yours. You were taught it was something to guard, control, watch, and if not, it would betray you. An 8-year-old girl was scolded for running too hard because it was immodest. A 10-year-old was mocked for budding breasts. Her mother didn't hug her, just pulled her collar higher and glared, cover it up. You didn't know why bathing felt strange. You just knew you had to feel ashamed. When your first period came, you were locked in a room, forbidden to tell anyone, and only taught to wash the cloth in cold water. No one explained why the blood came. They only stressed, Don't let anyone see. Don't let anyone smell. Don't let anyone know. Your body was something to hide, but no one said for whom. You just understood. If someone saw, it was your fault. If someone felt desire, it was your fault. If someone touched you, it was probably how you dressed. No one said men's bodies should be accountable for their actions. Only you, living in skin deemed overly tempting, had to bear the guilt. Every move was watched. You couldn't sit with knees apart, couldn't sway your hips walking, couldn't show your neck while washing your hair. As you grew, every part of you was dissected and judged. Eyes couldn't be too bright, lips couldn't curve for no reason, wrists couldn't show veins, ankles couldn't be too round. Anything could be a reason for condemnation. So you learned to hate your body, hate its curves, hate its soft skin, hate its natural scent, hate the laugh rising from your chest. You learned to look down, to hunch your shoulders, to clasp your hands over your stomach, as if apologizing for existing. And if someone stared, you didn't ask, "Why is he looking?" You asked, "What did I do wrong?" You didn't know you had the right to love yourself. You only knew to fear yourself. And when it came time to marry, you entered marriage with a heart full of fear. You didn't know touch could be gentle, loving, connective. You only knew to lie still, close your eyes, pray it ended, pray there wasn't too much blood, pray you weren't called difficult, cold, or worse, nothing special. You weren't taught to listen to your body, weren't allowed to ask, "What do I want?" You were only taught to serve, and if you didn't serve right, you'd be replaced. No divorce papers needed, just a few rumors, a cold glance, a meal left uneaten, a night your husband didn't come home, and you'd blame yourself, because you were taught your body was a tool, and if it didn't work right, you were trash. When you gave birth to a girl, and realized you didn't know how to teach her to love her body, because you were never taught that a woman's body is sacred, worthy of pride, a miracle. You only knew it was a risk, and you'd pass that fear down like a cursed heirloom. Because in this world, women were forbidden to look in mirrors, not out of vanity, but out of fear of seeing themselves exist. And if you feared your own body, how could you claim ownership of it? You couldn't, and that's why they invented the chastity belt, a cold metal contraption locked between your legs, as if you were a prisoner, your only crime being that you had a vagina. They gave it a name that sounded like jewelry, chastity belt, a heart-shaped shackle, a shackle not for your wrists, but for your desire to live, your lust, your curiosity, and every feeling that made you human, forged from iron, bronze, or steel. Some were so ornate people mistook them for art, but really, they were a precise design of fear and control. They'd say the chastity belt was to protect you, to keep you pure while your husband was away, to guard against weakness or the devil's temptation. But everyone knew the truth. It wasn't for you, it was for them, to ensure you couldn't be free, that you were locked, that your body wasn't yours, that every entry to life was sealed with a lock and a curse called virtue. And if you think this was just legend, sorry, it wasn't. Chastity belts have been found in museums across Europe, from Italy to Germany, France to England. Some were so heavy, they caused sores within hours. Some had inward spikes, meant to prevent rape, but only hurt the wearer. Some wore them all summer, unable to remove them, despite infections, bleeding, fever, and do you know what hurt most? They called it love. They said it was for your own good. Your mother helped you put it on, and she cried, but didn't take it off, because she'd been locked like that too. And in her mind, survival meant acceptance, endurance, obedience. Many thought chastity belts were only for noble women to keep bloodlines pure. But the truth is, cheaper versions were made for village girls, servants, young women forced to stay virgins, not for prestige, but because no one trusted them. If you were a blacksmith's wife and he was away, the belt was how he slept soundly. If you were a farmer's daughter, it was how he protected his investment. If you were a maid in a noble house, it was how they kept the family's name clean. And when you wore it, you couldn't walk normally. Each step cut into your thighs. Sitting felt like sitting on thorns. Every deep breath made the metal creak as a reminder, freedom wasn't for you. And no, you couldn't complain. If you did, they'd say, "Aren't you ashamed? We're doing this for your own good." You'd purse your lips, nod, and try not to cry as cold metal pressed against your privates. You'd pretend to feel protected, while inside you knew This wasn't armor against crime. It was a symbol of distrust, a declaration that we don't believe you can control yourself. And that distrust, or rather, its absence, was legitimized by a lock. No one asked, why don't men wear belts? Why not lock their desires? Why not make a tool to remind them to stay decent? The answer is simple, because they weren't seen as the threat. Only you, with a body demonized by biology, emotions doubted, an innocent glance twisted into invitation, were the danger that needed containment. The chastity belt was never about preventing sin. It was a tool for producing shame, a shackle gilded with hypocritical morality, a symbol that women weren't trusted, empowered, or taught to own themselves, only caged, bound, locked, with stainless steel that reeked of fear. When your mind was controlled,
When every dream, desire, emotion was molded, you didn't just forget self-determination. You forgot you ever had desires.
because when your body was locked, your soul rotted too, and you had nothing left to keep, except the key someone else held, forever. But more painful than that lock was the person holding it, always the loudest to preach about virtue. In that village, that parish, at markets and pulpits, there was always a man with a stern voice, clutching a Bible, wearing a wide-brimmed hat or a short cloak. He had 5 children, all from different wives. The first died after her 3rd birth. The second was brought in to care for the children. The third was sent back to her father for lacking discipline. The 4th vanished after a cold winter, no questions asked. And the 5th, still alive, but no one saw her outside church hours. She appeared behind a thick veil, shopped before dawn, always looking down. She had no name. People called her his wife, and he, the man with 5 children, 4 marriages, 3 widows or discards, was the loudest about how women today no longer keep themselves. Every Sunday, he stood in the church or market square, pointing at young girls and saying, "Women these days only know how to smile with their gums, sit with legs apart, and flash lustful eyes." No one dared argue. No one dared ask, "What did you do to your 5 women?" No one dared mention the 17-year-old maid who cried in the stable after he left a sermon. Because he was a man, and men in that era didn't need to be clean to preach cleanliness. They just needed to be loud, stern, critical enough of women to be seen as moral. Their private lives, men's business, no one interfered. A priest accused of raping a parishioner went back to preaching about Eve's temptation. A monk who beat his wife to miscarriage was still chosen to keep the parish records because he was strict. But you, an unmarried girl fetching water in worn shoes, just bending too long at the well made you flirtatious. No balance, no verification, no dialogue, just one direction, where men like him, with tattered pasts and powerful presence, got to define morality for the world. And worse, they succeeded, because they knew how to sow fear. They knew how to retell a woman's life as a warning. That woman's daughter, 17, and already wearing rouge, that one left her husband because she's lustful, couldn't stand the quiet. An unmarried girl passing a man's house in the afternoon lacks propriety. Each sentence was a stone, and those stones piled on you until you couldn't stand straight. No one asked how you lived. They only asked if you looked proper, and you had to be proper, their way. You had to be silent, not laugh loudly, not walk fast, not linger too long at the strawberry stall, because red is a sensual color, not wash your hair in the afternoon, not sing at dusk, not read alone. Because those things, according to the man with 5 children, were signs of depravity. You were taught to live by the mold of a man who never lived what he preached, and worse, you started to believe him. You wondered if you were truly flawed,
If your voice was too loud,
if last night's dream was a sign of the devil, if the flutter from someone's touch was proof of sin. He sowed doubt in you, and that doubt, like mold growing silently in a house's walls, spread, gnawing at the last scraps of your self-respect, until one day you saw him standing there, in the crowd, giving the same sermon, same voice, same eyes, and you, instead of anger, felt emptiness. You'd heard it so long you had no strength left to resist, and that's when they won. When you stopped asking, "Why does he get to say that?" and only asked, "Where did I go wrong?" When you were condemned, not by actions, but by glances, not by words, but by rumors. No trial needed, because the whole village was the jury, and you had no lawyer, just a mud-stained dress, a soft cough in the night, and a misplaced glance, enough to brand you surely no longer pure, but in truth, you were never pure, by their standards, because to them, you were never a person. You were property, a commodity to be traded, negotiated, bribed, valued, an item that could be returned if it wasn't up to spec, a name replaced by a new title, that man's wife, that man's girl, the new bride. At every feast, marriage talk didn't start with love, but with money, and you stood amid those numbers, as if you weren't a person with a heart, lungs, a soul, but a walking dowry. Men sat together, bargaining. How much land does your daughter come with? Can she embroider? Any illness in the family? Any rumors about her? If the answers satisfied, they nodded. A wedding was set. You had no right to know, no right to object, no right to ask. Why him? It was all decided before you even learned to braid your hair. One girl once cried out, "But I don't love him." Her mother shot her a look sharp as a knife. Love comes later. Keeping the estate comes now. The girl bowed her head. That night, a ring was exchanged. No questions asked. Just a successful deal. You were wrapped in a heavy, gold-stitched dress, veiled and led away like a gift that couldn't speak. At the destination, they lifted the veil, eyed you head to toe, and if pleased, they smiled. If not, they smiled anyway, because their disappointment would be voiced later, behind your back, because you were a transferred good. No returns, no warranty, and no one promised to care for you. Don't think the dowry was just a side note. It was your entire worth in their eyes. If you came with 3 acres, you were valued more than the girl with 2. If you brought 5 cows, 2 woven dresses, and a chest of silver plates, you were a good match. But if you had nothing, or your parents were dead, or your brother once stole a neighbor's turnip, you were a risk, and no one wanted to marry a risk. Someone once said, marrying a wife is marrying wealth, and they believed it. No one married you for you. They married you for what came with you. And once everything was in the husband's house, you became part of the estate, like the chickens, the buffalo, the oven, valued, depreciated, with duties attached. If you didn't bear children soon, didn't work enough, didn't endure well, you were a failed investment. One girl was called bad luck, just for not conceiving after a year. Her mother-in-law said, her mother must have cursed her. Her husband said, I knew she was too quiet when we wed. No one asked how she was living. They only asked, why hasn't our house got a grandson yet? Meanwhile, she washed clothes by the river, hands wrinkled, stomach empty, heart emptier still, because she knew she wasn't a wife. She was a walking dowry, a living chest, and like any chest, they opened it when needed and ignored it when not. Worse, if the husband's family fell on hard times, you'd be blamed. Since she stepped into this house, everything's gone dark. Maybe she stepped on a grave as a child. She probably wasn't a virgin. Anything could be pinned on you, because you weren't a person. You were a symbol, a stand-in for fortune or misfortune, something anyone could criticize, blame, dissect, scrutinize. You entered marriage not to build anything, but to prove you were worth the price they paid. And if not, your value was chipped away. No one said it aloud, but you felt it in your husband's eyes, your mother-in-law's sighs, your sister-in-law's, she eats too much, the way you were no longer called by name, but that one. Slowly, you stopped calling yourself by name in your own mind. You lived as an item stuck between 2 homes. The old one wouldn't take you back, the new one didn't care to love you. When a woman was betrothed before she could speak a full sentence, and the wedding was decided after her mother died, because in that world, you weren't born to live for yourself, but to continue the chain of bondage the previous generation deemed order. And one of the tightest links in that order was the value of virginity. Not moral value, not spiritual value, but literal value. Numbers, goods, trade, offerings, the transfer between families. Your virginity was priced like an ancient coin or a young calf, never taken to market. They haggled, negotiated, calculated, weighed every detail, as if your vagina bore a coded seal. And ironically, though everyone called virginity sacred, the only thing society cared about was its worth. A pure girl could secure her parents 2 sacks of grain, a small plot, a buffalo, or a few silver bars. But if she was used, whether true or rumored, whether by rape or looking at someone too long, that value plummeted. One girl was called dirty for kissing a boy in the woods. Just a kiss, nothing more, but it ended any hope of a good marriage. Her father sold her cheap to an old man near death to cut losses. She didn't cry because she knew tears wouldn't change her worth in their eyes. A raped girl, if no blood, no witnesses, no clear resistance, was still lost. And because she was lost, she was worthless for negotiation. She was sold as a servant, or worse, married off without dowry, like clearing inventory. Virginity became a unit of measure, applied only to women. No one asked if a man was still pure. No one priced him by his touches. No one counted his lingering looks. Only you, your body twisted into a warehoused item, were labeled intact, nearly intact, no longer intact, or worst, uncertain. And uncertain, sometimes the heaviest verdict, because doubt killed you slower than condemnation. People avoided you. No one came to propose. Neighbors whispered. Your mother grew quieter. You were locked indoors, barred from fields or markets. And in desperation, many families chose to restore honor. Some mothers mixed chicken blood into the wedding bed. Some aunts sent girls to other villages. New names, new histories. Some sisters bribed priests for certificates of virtue. All to buy back what you hadn't lost, but others stole with rumors. Valuing virginity wasn't just negotiation. It was a sophisticated system of abuse. Because when you were a commodity, anyone could check quality, and that check was never voluntary. Some girls were stripped in the market because a future mother-in-law demanded to inspect her gait. Some were pushed into dark rooms with midwives to check tightness. Some were examined twice before the wedding, just to ensure blood would flow. They didn't ask if it hurt. They only asked, is she worthy? And if the answer was no, even vaguely, even imagined, the world withdrew every kindness it ever offered. No one wanted to touch a used item. And worse, women were forced to uphold that system. Mothers taught daughters to guard themselves. Aunts taught nieces how to sit to keep value. Grandmothers taught daughters-in-law not to show calves. Each generation preserved that imposed value, as if it were sacred. But it wasn't sacred. It was fear dressed in morality. And that fear made you, when thinking of love, first ask, if they know I'm not pure, will they leave me? Even if you did nothing wrong. Even if the other was at fault. Even if your body was intact, but your reputation was killed long ago. When you were judged as a criminal, not for actions, but for something deep in your body that others always thought they owned. And if they no longer had that right, you no longer had the right to live as a person. That's when you realized it was all a game. But a game designed so you'd never win. No matter how good you were, how chaste, how bowed, avoidant, silent, submissive, you could still be cast out any time, just because someone decided she's no longer pure. You wore a long dress, they said you were hiding something. You wore a short one, they called you wanton. You didn't smile, they said you were haughty. You smiled, they said you were inviting. You married late, they called you undesirable. You married early, they said you were eager. You had no children, they said you were cursed. You had many, they said you were greedy. You were wrong in everything, wrong in doing nothing. And they always had a reason to hate you, because this game didn't need fairness. It just needed your fear. Fear of being labeled, fear of losing value, fear of staying unmarried, fear of your mother's tears, fear of your father's anger, fear of village whispers, fear of yourself. And from that fear, they built a maze. You thought if you navigated it right, carefully, you'd reach a place called peace. But no, because when you looked back, you saw the destination didn't exist. Every step you took, they moved the goal. Today you were praised as gentle, tomorrow criticized as dull. Today you cooked well. Tomorrow they asked, can you bear children? Today you bore a son. They said, why not two? All your efforts were swallowed by a pit called not enough, and you were always the one held accountable. If your husband cheated, it was because you didn't keep him. If neighbors leered, it was because you left the door open. If your mother-in-law disliked you, it was because you weren't proper. If your child cried all night, it was because you didn't know motherhood. They built a system to keep you low, to make you always prove yourself, always apologize, always shrink. And if you dared stand up, dared ask, why must I bear it all? They'd say, that woman's rebelling now, and you'd be out. This game didn't tolerate rule breakers. They didn't need you to win. They needed you to keep playing, enduring, wearing down. A woman lived to 60, looked back, and said, "I don't remember the last time I slept without worry." She didn't know what it felt like to walk without hunching, to eat a full meal without complaints, to know love, only duty, to know dreams, only obligations, because from the start, she was placed on a board, tilted against her. You were a pawn, pushed forward, no retreat, and when no moves remained, you were swept off without a glance. You were the family's shadow, society's shadow, the shadow of rules. No one wrote, but everyone obeyed. You weren't told the rules, just do it like this. That's a good woman. But who defined good? A man with 5 children by 3 wives, a mother-in-law who never asked if you were okay, a neighbor aunt who spied on your comings and goings. The answer, no one knew, but everyone could judge you, and you had no right to argue back. The more you argued, the more they called you flawed, the more you stayed silent, the more they assumed you were hiding. This game didn't need your intelligence, didn't need your strength, didn't need your goodness. It just needed you to endure. And so you lived a lifetime in a contest with no prize. Each year you marked a tally on the wall, counting the times you held back, nearly cried but swallowed it, turned away when your drunk husband slammed the table, carried chickens to market in the rain without sighing. You hoarded pain like capital, but no one counted it, no one acknowledged your sacrifices. They only asked, "Why is she so worn out now?" And if you died, they'd only say she couldn't handle it. The end. When does a woman, after a lifetime playing by others' rules, decide to flip the board? And what happens when rebellion is no longer what they fear, but what they deserve? Because in the end, no one should play a game designed only to punish them. But how could you flip the board when the one who first taught you to place your hand on the pawn was your mother? She didn't want you to suffer, but she didn't teach you to live. She taught you to survive. Every word, action, frown from her carried the scars of a world she'd learned to endure until she no longer knew what true existence meant. At 6, she taught you to sit with knees closed, not for manners, but so people won't talk. At 8, she didn't teach you jump rope or flute playing, but how to glare back at anyone staring longer than 3 seconds. At 10, she took you to sew thicker dresses, saying this is safer. At 12, she began warning you not to run too hard, sit near boys, smile at adults, bathe in the afternoon, speak loudly, or say anyone's name more than twice a day. Her words weren't to help you understand life, but to keep life from crushing you too hard. She didn't want you to fly. She just wanted you not to break your wings like she did. Your mother was the first to say, women must know how to endure. She didn't explain why, just repeated it, like a mantra, like an evening prayer. Endure, so your husband loves you. Endure to please your mother-in-law. Endure so your children aren't scorned. Endure to not shame the family. She spoke of endurance as if it were fabric for armor, and you wore it, not knowing it didn't protect. It just made breathing harder. Once you asked, why not argue when they're wrong? She shook her head. What's the point? Arguing changes nothing. It just makes people hate you more. You didn't understand, but you remembered, and you began to do as she did. Swallow anger, smile, nod, step back. Each time you did, she looked at you with pride. Good girl, so clever, she said. And you grew up thinking, clever meant knowing how to vanish at the right moment, knowing to close your eyes to injustice, smiling when your heart bled, choosing silence over saying what displeased others. But when you looked at your mother, the woman who taught you this, what did you see? A frail figure, sitting quietly in a corner, eyes always gazing somewhere far off. A woman whose only dream was to be left in peace. A wife who never complained when her husband drank, never argued when her mother-in-law scolded, never cried aloud when her child died. She didn't teach you to love life. She taught you to fear it. She didn't teach you to open your heart. She taught you to lock your mouth. And she did it not out of hate, but out of too much love. She thought, if you endured well, you'd hurt less. If you submitted well, you'd be harmed less. She didn't know that her silent training stole your ability to dream. She didn't know how to teach you to live, because no one taught her. She too was born in a leaky straw-roofed house, with a father quick to raise his hand, a mother who only wept quietly, and a village that said, she's still lucky. She too was once a girl who laughed, sang, played in the rain. But layers of rules, silent slaps, and neighbors' frowns carved her into a woman who bowed to everything and passed that survival art to you as a worthy inheritance. Your mother wasn't wrong. She was deceived, convinced it was the only way to exist. She thought, if you were good enough, you'd be spared. But she didn't know this system spared no one. It devoured even the most obedient, even those who tried their hardest to live right. And she didn't realize what she taught you was pulling you further from yourself. You wanted to paint. She said, why paint? No one marries you for pretty drawings. You wanted to master reading. She warned, too clever, and no one will like you. You wanted to say you were sad. She waved it off. Don't act weak. You're a girl. Each time you tried to live, she taught you to step back, and you thought she must be right, until one day you looked in the mirror and didn't see yourself. Only a girl playing the role of a proper woman, scripted by your mother. What happens when you start to ask, was she right? Is surviving really living? And is it time to stop? Not because you hate her, but because you want to rewrite the script from scratch, for yourself and for the daughters yet unborn, because you deserve a life, not just a string of survival days. But even as you begin to question, to rewrite your own script, you'd soon realize what you thought was personal, like virginity, was never truly yours. Because over centuries, virginity wasn't just about the body. It was elevated into a symbol of nation, religion, people, collective honor. A biological membrane, thinner than an onion, skin became an excuse for men to take up swords and call it duty. When a woman was raped in war, they didn't ask if she survived. They asked, is she still intact? And if she wasn't, the village, the clan, the nation could erupt in rage, not out of pity for her, but because they felt shamed. She was seen as living proof of failure, a white flag raised in an invasion, a symbol of disgrace. But no one mentioned the one who committed the crime. The rapist was the enemy, obviously, but it was the village, the kin, the allies who finished her off with their contempt. Some villages banished women raped by foreign soldiers, and fearing they carried impurity. Some mothers forced daughters to kill themselves after rape to preserve family honor. Some empires mobilized thousands of soldiers to avenge the humiliation of our women. And if you think it was compassion, you're wrong. They weren't angry for the victim's pain. They were angry for the violation of collective honor. Virginity became a cloak. Nations draped over women, only to tear it off if they needed to sacrifice them for a greater cause. In epics, myths, legends, virginity was inflated into a holy relic. The goddess Artemis in Greece, the Ice Queen of the North, the virgin oracles in European mother worship, all were required to stay absolutely pure. No love, no touch, no desire. Because if they opened their hearts, the magic would fade, the power would vanish, the nation would fall. And what's the message? That a people's survival, victory, or defeat rested on a woman's vagina. A pressure packaged in mysticism, but really absolute control. In the 14th century, some European nations required girls to carry virginity certificates, to work in churches. Some towns demanded young women wash hands in holy water before entering homes, to ward off temptation. During the Crusades, women were escorted by knights who swore to protect their virginity with blood, but no one protected them from those companions. No one wrote of the quiet deaths in the night, when a drunken holy soldier entered a tent and said, I have the right. When war broke out, women's names were used as reasons. We must fight back because they defiled our sisters. But after the fight, no one remembered where those sisters were, alive or dead. Were any compensated, apologized to, brought to light? No, they were forgotten or silenced, as if their worth only existed while they were intact. And when no longer intact, they vanished from history. No longer people, no longer witnesses, just a collective stain to be covered up. You think of your mother, your grandmother, the women who lived through turmoil. No one told you what they endured. They only said, those were hard times. They only said, you must keep yourself. But how, when an entire army saw your body as a spoil of war? How, when national virginity was built on the silent sacrifice of those never asked for consent? How, when they made you a symbol, without caring if you agreed to be one? Throughout history, women never got to decide their own virginity. They were told to keep it, but not when to stop, told to protect it, but no one protected them from violation, told to be a pride, but when harmed, they became a shame. And society, church, nation, no one took responsibility. If virginity wasn't something you could keep, choose, or use for safety, honor, or freedom, why were you taught it was your most precious possession? And more importantly, who truly benefited from you believing that? Because it's very likely virginity's value was never yours. It was the most sophisticated weapon ever invented to make you lock yourself away, believing you were being protected. But what if you stopped believing? If you looked at that rusted lock and dared ask, why must I lock myself? What would happen? The answer, you'd be punished. Not with silence anymore, but with fire. In a world where virginity measured worth, refusing to be owned was rebellion, and rebellion had to be burned. There was such a woman. Her name was erased from history, but the fire that consumed her was remembered for generations. She was the only daughter of a blacksmith. Bright eyes, black hair, sharp chin, and above all, she bowed to no one. When the richest man in the region proposed, she refused, bluntly. In the market, before the whole village, she said, I don't love him, and I won't sell myself just because his house has 300 acres. That wasn't just a refusal, it was a slap to the system. A kick to the idea that women must seize good opportunities. A spark lit in a forest of dogma, and like any spark, it was snuffed out. Fast, brutally, mercilessly. 3 days later, someone said they saw her smiling alone in the fields. 7 men swore she looked demonic. An orphan child claimed she whispered something that made a stray cat vanish. That was enough. She was called a witch, dragged to the church courtyard, bound with thorny ropes, forced to confess to communing with darkness. Her mother fainted from crying. Her father couldn't look. She didn't scream, didn't beg, just stared into the crowd's eyes and said, You fear me, because I don't fear you. That sentence, later, no one dared repeat. They only remembered the crackling wood, the burning cloth, the popping of human skin in the evening breeze. Burning alive was a cruel verdict, but accepted as a cleansing ritual. They burned her not because they believed she was a witch, but because they needed an excuse to destroy refusal. Refusal to marry, refusal to submit, refusal to stay silent, refusal to be a pawn in the family's game. Refusal was blasphemy, and you had to pay, not just her, but anyone after her. Every woman who dared say no forced dozens to watch the spectacle as a warning. This is the end for those who think they have a choice. One girl refused marriage to learn to read. She was jailed for 3 days, then vanished. Another widow refused to remarry. Her house was set ablaze, and afterward, no one dared say her name. They called her that woman. No one was born to be kindling, but medieval society built pyres and was always ready to light them whenever someone stepped off the path they'd drawn. They used fire to burn not just flesh but defiance, to burn courage, to burn the desire for freedom, to burn the memory of those around. So years later, when someone asked, why can't we refuse? The answer was a long, heavy, paralyzing silence. In that silence, you heard the fire still burning, burning in your mother's mind, in your grandmother's memories, burning even without smoke. And you understood that woman didn't die for being wrong. She died for being right. Right too soon. Right when no one dared acknowledge it. She wasn't a witch. She was a mirror for others. And they hated it, because in her, they saw their own cowardice, saw the times they bowed when they should have stood, nodded when they wanted to scream, stepped back because of fear, and to avoid facing that truth, they agreed, better to burn her. So no evidence remained that they ever had a choice. We'll look at that system of burning, not just with fire, but with words, with rumors, sermons, glances, rejection. When women were no longer burned in the square, they were burned in people's hearts, stripped of honor, erased from feasts, ceremonies, praise, and the worst part, there was no ash to bury, only voids where a person should have lived, true to what she believed was right. But in the Middle Ages, living true wasn't a virtue, it was a declaration of war, and when you lived true, you weren't just burned, you were slandered, distorted, redefined. If you were attacked, it was because you provoked. If you were molested, it was because you intended. If you were killed, it was because you seduced him first. In a society where every fault could be pinned on a woman's skirt, even your death was your own fault. There's a story the villagers kept passing down about a shepherd girl raped by a castle guard at the forest's edge. She survived, dragged herself home, body bloodied and torn. But instead of help, she was interrogated. Why were you alone in the woods? Why didn't you scream? Why wear a red dress? Her mother whispered. If only you hadn't looked at him. She wasn't hugged, wasn't defended, wasn't believed. The guard swore. She smiled at me first, and that was enough. She was banished from the village. No one married her, no one hired her, no one spoke to her. He went on guarding, keeping order, and was buried near the church at the end of his life, because men always had reasons. They were never the criminals, only victims of enchantment. Women were the source of lust, the fire, the snake, the wordless invitation. They couldn't resist. They weren't taught to control themselves. They were taught to blame. A man killed his wife because she argued. A man beat his daughter because she glared. A man strangled his lover because she wouldn't understand. Each time a woman fell, a reason was built like a barricade to protect the man. And the terrifying part, society believed those reasons, even spread them as moral lessons. In one town, they spoke of a husband who beat his wife to death for stepping out after sunset. The villagers said she lacked discretion. In another region, a monk killed a 14-year-old girl, then claimed, she made me think impurely. They didn't jail him. They moved him to another parish, where he continued preaching about purity and temptation. Women, from adolescence, were taught their bodies were double-edged swords. If someone touched you, you could die and still be blamed for enticing. That sword wasn't in your hands, but you were blamed for it, and you had to learn to live like a volatile object, ready to explode at any moment. Every step, turn of the head, standing tall, glance, hair adjustment, soft smile, could be extracted, isolated, and framed as proof that you invited it. You were forced to learn to avoid your own existence, because if you were too present, you were labeled a seductress. If you were beautiful, you were a hazard. If you were smart, you were scheming. If you were silent, you were hiding something. If you resisted, you were mad. And if you died, that death was never just a tragedy. It was explained as the consequence of how you lived. That's where justice collapsed. Not because there were no laws, but because the laws were written by those who never thought you needed protecting. Those who believed if a man sinned, it was because a woman opened the door, opened her mouth, opened her heart, opened her body, and sin crawled out from there. A woman raped in a stable was condemned by the village for promiscuity. A woman killed for refusing a marriage was buried with a stone reading, passed due to a wayward fate. No one wrote, murdered, no one named the killer, because he wasn't society's enemy, he was its product, and society never condemned itself. In this story, you had no standing as a victim. You could only be the cause, and that broke you from within. Every time you stepped outside, you wondered, is this dress too short? Should I tie my hair back? Should my eyes look down? Is this smile too friendly? You didn't live. You performed the role of a woman who doesn't deserve harm. But that role had no script, because no one knew how to avoid blame in a society always ready to flip through your life and say, she should have known better. We'll talk about the cost of presence, when just crossing an invisible line drawn by others could choke everything you could have become in its cradle. When women weren't allowed to be themselves, the only choice left was to be invisible or vanish forever. And perhaps the greatest tragedy, even if you were killed, they'd still say it was because you made them unable to resist. They called it fate, destiny, unavoidable. And you, who loved the wrong person, at the wrong time, in the wrong context, became a living testament to a horrific definition. Love didn't save you. It only made you burn faster. In the Middle Ages, love was a luxury, especially if you were a woman, and worse, if you loved before someone permitted it. There was no such thing as free love. No relationship existed without being weighed by dowry, reputation, status, and approval. Loving someone not your husband, wrong. Loving someone before a betrothal, wrong. Loving someone poorer, lower, or unworthy, also wrong. And if you loved a man of status, you were gold-digging, seducing, setting a trap. In other words, loving at the wrong time, wrong person, wrong context, was a crime, and you had no defense. There was a girl, daughter of a baker. who fell for the mayor's son. They met at the market, talked a few times after church, shared silent glances, never kissed, never touched, never vowed. But rumors spread. Within 7 days, her parents were summoned. She was locked in her room. The boy was sent to another region to avoid scandal. It seemed over. But 3 months later, they found she was pregnant. She cried herself dry, begging to keep the child. Her mother whispered, "If there's no blood tonight, our whole family dies with you." That night, she was forced to drink herbs. The child never came to be. She lived, but never stepped into the light again. In that era, love wasn't a refuge. It was a trap, a stain if not licensed. 15-year-old girls married to 40-year-old men were settled, but 20-year-old girls, unmarried, unbetrothed, who looked too long at someone, were immoral. You couldn't love for feeling. You could only love when others allowed right person, right time, right status. And if you loved before, you were the one at fault. Your every emotion was watched like royal property. Your heart was a forbidden zone. And if someone entered without permission, both were judged. But only you were branded, flawed, because you carried love inside. You were where it grew, and you'd be blamed for not controlling it. Once, a girl ran off with her lover. They were caught 3 days later. He got 10 lashes. She was shaved bald, chained to the church gate for 2 days, then forced to marry a wealthy widower. People said, that's the price of folly. No one asked, why did she have to run? Why was her love a crime? Why was the desire for an unbound life seen as abhorrent? Because no one needed answers. They needed an example, a lesson for other girls starting to feel, a warning that if you loved wrong, you'd lose everything: reputation, family, freedom, yourself. Love rightly is the most beautiful thing a person can feel. But in that society, it was twisted into a test, and you, who carried a heart, was seen as dangerous. They told you to learn to restrain, to keep distance, to not dream, and so you grew up with framed rules. Love comes after marriage, after dowry, after parents' nods, after priests' blessings, after the village's witness. Only then was love not wrong. Anything before, however sincere, however pure, was sin. In cloistered convents, hundreds of love letters were found hidden under mattresses, in pillows, in brick crevices, stifled pieces of hearts, scribbled lines. I cannot say your name. Forgive this feeling. I wish I'd never known my heart could beat so fast. No one knows what became of those women, only that they loved, and for loving, they were erased from history. When your heart froze from fear, when every time you saw someone beautiful, you looked down, when you taught yourself emotions were a trap, and it was best to feel nothing. Because if love came at the wrong time, it wouldn't save you, it would kill you, and no one stood by you, even if you died for love. But suppose you survived, suppose you bowed at the right time, chose the right person, were properly married, bore children full term. Then, what? Did you get to live as a person? No, you just changed roles, from good daughter to proper wife, from gentle wife to dutiful mother, and finally to a shadow. You didn't vanish instantly, you vanished slowly, piece by piece, layer by layer, each morning cooking meals no one thanked, each night rocking a child while your husband snored like thunder. No one came to strip your personhood, they just asked you to surrender it, for duty. And you did, silently, unseen, until you looked in the mirror and asked, who am I? No one answered. They only said, a wife like that is good enough. A mother like that is fine. What more does a woman need? Each praise was a lock, and you were trapped in a room called sacrifice. No identity, no dreams, no depth, just tasks. Meals to cook, clothes to wash, beds to make, children to raise, husband to serve, mother-in-law to respect, village to uphold face for. You were encouraged to do everything except exist for yourself. You saw your mother live like that. You saw your grandmother live like that. They didn't smile, but they played their roles. They didn't know love, but fulfilled duties. They didn't read books, watch sunsets, or dream beyond the gate. But everyone said, that woman was great. No one asked, was she happy? Because joy wasn't in a wife's job description. Happiness wasn't something you could demand. You could only hope others were happy. Your husband could sit still. You couldn't. Your child could cry. You couldn't. Your mother-in-law could complain. You couldn't, because if you cried, who'd clean the house? If you were tired, who'd cook? If you were sad, who'd mind the children? You were the machine running everything, in silence, and if you broke, they wouldn't fix you. They'd replace you. They'd call you that dreary woman, an unattractive wife, a nagging mother. But no one asked, why did she become like that? In the Middle Ages, women weren't named in chronicles. They were called by their husbands' names: Thomas's wife, Jacob's mother, Grant's widow, and when they died, tombstones read, a faithful wife. No poetry, no biography, no line saying, she loved to paint, she loved daisies, she wanted to see the sea. Everything that made you, you dissolved into the role. And if you dared break out, dared say, I want more, you were called selfish. There was such a woman. She refused to marry, despite being of age. She said, I want to open a fabric shop. They laughed. They said, you'll die alone. She did it anyway. Her shop thrived, but no one remembered her effort. They only whispered, she's still unmarried. And when she died, they wrote died for not knowing how to be a wife. Being a mother didn't save you from invisibility. It only made you split your heart for another man called you lacking if you didn't give the rest. A mother died of exhaustion, but before closing her eyes, she said, take care of their father, as if her existence was never independent, as if she was just a link, chaining men across generations. A shadow has no shape. It only follows, takes blame, yields light, vanishes when others step in. And you, if not awake, were taught to be a shadow from your first steps. Each praise, such a good girl. She's proper. She's quiet, gentle, was a stone paving the path to where no one knew what you thought, wanted, needed. When you began to ask, if I'm not someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's sacrifice, what's left of me? And more importantly, do I have the right to live just as a person, without labels, without duties, without needing forgiveness for choosing myself? Because in the end, if your whole life was just a backdrop for others' happiness, who would build a stage for you to step into the light? The answer, no one. No one builds your stage. If you want to step out, you must walk through blood, through fire, through punishment. And sometimes, the price for one moment of daring to love, to live true, to lift your face from the dark, is a wound that never heals, like that girl. She was 17, first love. The boy was just a potter's son, poor, no land, no status, but he had bright eyes and calloused hands that always held hers when it was cold. They met under an apple tree each evening, with nothing but the smell of earth, the sound of wind, and beating hearts. First love. She thought sincerity was enough, but she forgot one thing in this world. Sincerity was the most dangerous thing you could carry. It began when her cousin saw them sitting close, not touching, just looking, but that was enough. The village knew. That night, her father raged. You've shamed this house. Her mother couldn't face her. They dragged her back like a criminal. The boy had no chance to explain. He was taken that night. 4 men beat him until his ribs broke, lips split, eyes swelled. They left him under the apple tree, where they used to meet. By morning, they found his body, dead from choking on his own blood. And she hadn't even cried yet. That noon, she was brought to the market, head shaved, locked in a 3-kilogram wooden yoke. A sign hung on her chest, defiler of family honor. They made her kneel for 5 hours. Children threw stones. Adults muttered curses. An old woman spat on her feet. A boy spat in her hair. She said nothing, didn't cry, didn't moan. She only thought, they don't know. They don't know. He only held my hand once. But truth didn't matter.
It's what mattered.
She loved and wasn't allowed to. She acted as if she had a heart, and that was enough to be condemned. When led home, her father said one thing, you're no longer my daughter. She was locked in a straw shed for 3 days. No food, no water. Her mother slipped a bread crust under the door, but no one apologized. No one asked if she was forced, if she said no, if she thought she was wrong, because no one cared about the truth. They just needed someone to blame, a scapegoat. And she, with shaved head, yoked neck, empty eyes, was the embodiment of the price to pay. No one mentioned the boy's cold body again. No one named who killed him. No one was arrested. No one judged, because everyone agreed He deserved it. For touching someone's daughter, even if it was just a glance, just sincerity, just the purest thing two young people could offer. But it was wrong, because loving the wrong person, at the wrong time, in the wrong class, wasn't love. It was crime. A crime not written in law books, but passed from grandmother to mother, father to grandfather, priest to teacher, making you so scared that a faster heartbeat made you slap your own face in the mirror. How many girls after stopped daring to love? How many children learned to stay silent when someone made them smile? How many hearts beat in secret chests, never daring to be loud? That girl lived on, but no longer herself. Her hair grew back, the yoke was removed, but her eyes stayed down forever. She married as arranged, bore 3 children, worked tirelessly like others, but no one saw her smile again. No one heard her stories. No one saw her look at anyone for more than 3 seconds. She lived like a ghost who could cook, clean, knit. But inside, she died the day they killed him. When you're punished for loving, you learn to hate your own heart, and that sometimes hurts more than death. When you're punished for loving, you learn to hate your own heart, and that sometimes hurts more than death. But even if you learn to lock your heart, told yourself not to love, not to trust, not to hope, it still wasn't enough to protect you. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to do anything wrong to be destroyed. Sometimes, just a rumor, a careless word, a jealous glance, a letter no one knew who wrote, and then a real death. The story began with a piece of paper, a love letter found in the vegetable basket of a priest's wife. They rumored it was written by her, a girl who learned to read in the convent, tasked with copying holy texts. She'd never written a love letter, never even spoken to men outside church hours, but the letter bore a signature, like her name, addressed to a Thomas. They read it aloud in church like a criminal charge. The final line, "When night falls, I'll come." No one asked, who put the letter in the basket? Who wrote it? Who had motive? Who benefited? No one examined the ink, the paper, the grammar, because they didn't need truth. They needed an excuse, and now they had one. The priest was sent away, but not judged. The girl locked in a stone cellar for 2 days. No food, no sleep, no speaking. They waited for her to confess. When she said she knew nothing of the letter, they called it a sign of stubborn sin. When she cried, they said tears proved hidden shame. When she was silent, they said she was hiding something terrible. On the 3rd day, they brought her to the market, hands tied behind her back, made her walk around the well, a sign on her neck. Harlot, who lied to God, people threw tomatoes, garbage, mud, and vile words. Someone shouted, "Throw her in the river to see if she floats." In that society, if you were rumored a witch, they tossed you in the river. If you floated, you were burned. If you sank, you were innocent and drowned. She wasn't thrown in the river. But that night, they found her hanged in the cell. No suicide note, no final words, just a torn cloth around her neck and purple bruises on her wrists. They called it an act of remorse, but someone whispered, "I saw the guard enter her cell at midnight." That person was told to shut up. After the funeral, the fake letter was burned. No one kept it as evidence. No one traced who wrote it. No one apologized. They just said, "What a pity," and went on with festivals, markets, prayers, as if no one had died. She vanished, as if she'd never existed. But in the memories of those who saw her face was a truth no one dared speak. Here, a rumor was stronger than a life. Some rumors came from envy, from jealousy, because you were prettier, better, noticed. Some were woven from nothing. I saw her cross the field at dusk. I heard her sing a love song. I think she looked at the priest too long. A rumor didn't need logic. It just needed to fit the fears already in listeners' minds. And if you were a woman, you were the perfect target for pinning, twisting, sacrificing, because you had no right to argue. No microphone, no lawyer, no benefit of the doubt. When a lie was repeated 3 times, it became fate, and you were framed in the slander others invented. After that death, many girls stopped admitting they could read. Many convents banned women from copying texts. Love letters, real or fake, were burned clean. They didn't want anyone dreaming, didn't want anyone thinking they could live with an open heart, because one letter, just one letter, led to a death, and that death was framed as a moral lesson. When every sound could be used against you, keeping silent wasn't a choice, it was instinct. And when you were forced to live like a ghost, guarding secrets, the question wasn't whether you lied, but whether you were allowed to speak at all. Because here, truth didn't save you. It only pushed you faster to the end. Others had written for you, with the ink of suspicion and the seal of so-called communal honor. The prettiest girl in the village was hated. The ugliest was forgotten. Both were lonely. And no one asked, was anyone accepted just for being herself? The answer? No, because they didn't want a person. They wanted a version that fit their standards. When a society only judges your shell, you slowly learn to see yourself through others' eyes. And that's when you start to vanish, not in life, but in your soul, because you don't know what's you versus what they want to see. And when you lose that distinction, you're no longer a person, you're a reflection, living forever as a shapeless shadow. But even if you shrank yourself, adjusted every gesture, tied your hair neatly, wore high collars, avoided long looks, loud laughs, going out alone, it still wasn't enough, because an invisible prison followed your every step. No locks, no guards, no gates, but no one escaped. It was the villagers' eyes. Those seemingly harmless gazes weighed heavier than spears. They trailed you from market to home, from well to hill, from your parents' doorstep to the field after mass. They didn't need words, just looked, long, steady, deep, as if weighing you on an invisible moral scale they'd invented. And whichever way you tipped, you were always wrong. You washed at the well in the late afternoon. They looked, wore an old, tight dress. They looked, walked with a man, even a cousin. They looked, walked alone, unchaperoned. They looked, came late after prayers. They looked, then they spoke, not to your face, behind your back, when you turned away, before you got home, as you left the path, a whisper light as wind, but spreading like fire, in dry straw. That girl's not like the others. Her smile gives me chills. Probably learned tricks from those old widows. Her walk says it all. They spoke without knowing anything, without verifying, without witnesses. They just needed you to be slightly different. A birthmark on your neck, a trip to the well at dawn, a laugh without being asked, a gaze at the sky too long. Anything could be evidence. Because the village didn't need truth. They needed order. And the easiest way to keep order was to make everyone the same, or cast them out. One girl with back pain walked slightly hunched. They said, she's hiding something. A soldier's wife couldn't conceive. They said, she's cursed. A girl with big eyes, long hair, quiet. They said, possessed. Then one day, she vanished. No one asked. Just nodded, told you so. You lived in the village, like in a cage. Every door was open, but you didn't dare step through. Every rooster's crow was a bell signaling, new day, new verdict. A verdict not from a court, from mouths, no records but consequences. No guards but your mother, sister, neighbor, the vegetable seller, the blacksmith, the 10-year-old, already taught to see others as criminals. And you couldn't hide. Even if you fled to the mountains, lived alone in a tattered hut, they'd say, what's she doing up there? If you stayed, shut indoors all day, they'd say, she's hiding something shady. If you attended mass regularly, sat in front, recited prayers clearly, they'd say, hypocrite. If you skipped mass, stayed home tired, they'd say, arrogant. Doing nothing, you were watched. Doing something, watched. Doing it right, questioned. Doing it wrong, no need to explain. Slowly, you stopped thinking, what do I want? You only thought, how do I make them think nothing? But that was impossible, because the villagers' eyes didn't need a reason to suspect. They suspected because you were a woman, and women to them were always suspect. Quiet, you were hiding something. Cheerful, you were seducing someone. Stubborn, you were tainted. Gentle, you were faking innocence. You were taught to live like a timid beast, sniffing the air, listening, curling up at any stir. And if you tired, if you cried, if you broke the unspoken rules, they had a hammer ready to nail you with a new label. She's gone mad. And when a woman was labeled mad, her voice became a howl. No one believed. No one listened. And if she vanished, it was a relief. When instead of asking, Who am I? You asked. Who do they think I am? That question, small as it seemed, was the crux that made generations of women forget they had souls, voices, dreams beyond those prying eyes. But sadly, no one taught you to look in the mirror, only to see through others' eyes and build your own prison. No walls, no gates, but the strongest prison ever made, and in that prison, some lived their whole lives without knowing they were caged. Some died without leaving a name, only rumors, like that widow, the woman I heard about my whole childhood, but never spoken of kindly. She lived at the village's edge, in a wooden house with a rotting thatch roof. Her husband died in a logging accident just after she bore her first child. No one came to mourn. No one helped bury him. They said, serves her right. That kind of woman brings bad luck to her husband's house. From then, she lived alone, never remarried, never shopped with others, skipped mass, didn't greet. Her son, when he began to walk, was shunned too. Village children were told, don't play with him. His mother's, that woman. No one explained what that woman meant, but everyone understood. A scent of suspicion, an invisible stain, a nameless crime, enough to bar you from every door, just for living, just for not dying with your husband, just for carrying a basket to gather mushrooms to feed your child, instead of drowning yourself in the well as they expected. Because in that society, a woman wasn't allowed to live on if she didn't fit the mold. Did she do anything wrong? No. But she existed outside the collective, outside doctrine, outside ritual. She didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't ask for help, and that bothered them. Because in that place, you had to need someone, owe someone, bow, be proper. Then they'd feel safe that you weren't dangerous. That widow didn't. She grew vegetables, ground flour, patched clothes, built fences, carried her son to gather wood, and they looked at her, not with pity, but with wariness. Then one day her child fell gravely ill. She carried him over 2 miles to the village healer's house, knocked 3 times. No one answered. They peered through cracks, saw her, and pretended to be out. She sat there all night. The child burned, trembling, rain, wind, cold. By morning she returned. The child died that afternoon. No one came, no prayers, no funeral pyre. Just a small hole in the forest behind her house, and a mother sitting beside it, not crying, not speaking, just staring at the fresh dirt. The next day, they rumored she probably killed him for some dark ritual. A week later, someone threw stones at her window. A month later, they told each other to avoid the road by her house. A year later, no one called her by name, just that woman. What was her crime? No one said. No charges, no court, no evidence. Her mere presence made them uneasy because she didn't follow their rules, didn't wail when her husband died, didn't beg for help, didn't send her son to a monastery, didn't leave the village. She did the worst thing a woman could do in that world, lived on without permission. That nameless crime clung to her until her end. When she died, no one came to shroud her. Village children were told she died cursed. No one mentioned her son's death. No one spoke of that rainy night. No one asked if someone had opened the door. Would the boy have lived? No one felt at fault, because in that story, they were the righteous. They were the community, the keepers of order, and that widow was what no one wanted to become. Not because she was bad, but because she was a reminder that you could do everything right and still be cast out. You could love your husband, raise your child, harm no one, and still be treated as dangerous, just for existing differently than they wanted. And if they couldn't control you, they called you heretic, deformed, abnormal, a seed of chaos. They didn't need you to sin. They needed you not to obey. Those women, not rebellious, not destructive, not wrong, except for living without permission. And for living so, they were given a nameless crime, a wordless verdict, a darkness no one saw, but all feared catching. And if you weren't careful, if you didn't comply, you'd be the next called by that empty title, that woman, not by name, but by the village's silence, silent, but harder than yokes, colder than stone, heavier than any prison. But if you thought being good, keeping yourself, living properly, would keep you safe, you forgot that keeping yourself was the most dangerous tool that society ever crafted to strangle women. Keeping yourself wasn't a choice. It was a condition of survival. You had to keep your gaze, your laugh, your posture, your clothes folds, your dreams, your breath, and above all, keep the so-called purity. Every man near you was a test. Every careless word a trial awaiting confession. If you didn't keep, you were depraved. But if you kept too well, you were stubborn, haughty, hard to tame. One girl, 16, refused a rich man's son's proposal because she didn't want to leave her village. That's simple. But his family took it as an insult. 3 days later, her father received a package. Inside, a vial of holy water stained with blood and a dead sparrow. That night, she was locked in a grain shed, bolted shut. No light, no food. 3 days. When the door opened, she'd lost her voice, couldn't speak, just stared into the void. No one was arrested. No one took blame. Her mother only said, "Better you'd married him than bring this curse on us." The girl didn't cry, didn't resist, just nodded silently at the next proposal. After marriage, beaten for showing attitude, but no one defended her. They said she was stubborn from childhood, because here, keeping yourself wasn't just for you, it was for others' honor, for your parents' face, for your husband's family's dignity, for the village's peace. You couldn't be tired, couldn't say no, couldn't choose, and if you kept too long untouched, they said you had issues, and those issues needed fixing. Another girl, beautiful, reserved, skilled at needlework, but unpursued, because she didn't smile. They called her proud, then rumored, she's cursed. One day, she drank tea, her lips turned purple, she collapsed, died suddenly. No doctor came, just a neighbor whispering, should have married sooner. Keeping yourself, without obedience, was a thorn. One refusal could enrage a clan, one headshake could spark hatred, and they'd find reasons to teach you. Beat, because spare the rod, spoil the child. Lock, because you need to reflect. Poison, because we're preventing worse. All because you didn't open the door. But no one asked. Open for whom? How far is enough? When could you say no? In that society, no was always the wrong answer, and yes was only accepted if it came at the right time, to the right person, in the right context. But you couldn't decide when your heart opened. They told you to keep, but raged if you kept for yourself. So you learned to live as your own jailer, guarding every thought, locking every emotion, stopping every stir of feeling. You became a colorless, odorless, soundless statue, nodding to every question, yielding to every demand, bowing to every mistake, and slowly, keeping yourself, stopped being a virtue. It was a rigid, dying existence, wasting from within. And if one day you fell from exhaustion, from resentment, from a heart crushed by being suppressed too long, they called it silent sacrifice. They'd write on your grave, a virtuous woman. They'd tell your story as a shining example for the next generation. But no one mentioned the bruised hands. No one spoke of the fear at nightfall. No one carved the last question you took to the grave. Kept for whom? For what? And you'd see, in a world where purity was the highest ideal, a girl's death could be celebrated, as long as she died, still saying yes. Because yes was the last thing they needed from you. Not your life, not your thoughts, not your dignity, just the nod. And virginity, the symbol of everything you were forced to bear your whole youth. Did it save you? No, it was the only thing that killed you, if you didn't have it. Virginity in the Middle Ages wasn't private, it was public property. It belonged to your family, to your future husband, to the priest hearing confession, to the clan's reputation, but never to you. It was spoken of at every ceremony, every betrothal contract, every church sermon, guarded like buried gold, inspected like market goods, valued like unblemished cloth. And if someone doubted you'd lost it, even without proof, you could be jilted, shunned, burned alive. One girl, 15, was raped on her way home from mass. The culprit was a landlord's son. He gagged her with a ceremonial cloth, whispering, "Stay quiet, no one will know." But blood stained her dress. She couldn't hide it. At home, her mother screamed, fainted. Her father, instead of comforting, whipped her 3 times in the yard, not for being harmed, but because her value was gone. That night, a healer was called to check her. She lay there, naked, crying dry, prodded by an old man like a sick pig. By morning the verdict, no longer intact, and that was it. Betrothal cancelled. Family lost the dowry. She was locked in an old chicken coop. 3 days later, they found her hanged with the same headscarf from the mass. No one named the rapist. He married another, fathered 7 children, lived to 60. She was remembered by 2 words: ill-bred. See that? Virginity didn't save her, didn't shield, protect, or stop crime. But if it was gone by violence, accident, or rumor, your life collapsed like a termite-ridden bed. You wouldn't marry, couldn't enter a convent, couldn't be a godmother, couldn't be buried in holy ground. You were a defective object, a bruised fruit, a torn package, and everyone had the right to talk about you, criticize you, condemn you, without listening to you. But if you kept it, what then? They called you a lotus, held you up as an example, used you to shame other girls, but they still didn't give you a voice. You couldn't choose who to love, couldn't refuse who you didn't want, couldn't keep your body as sacred, because they didn't praise you for you. They praised what you hadn't lost. And if you lost it, in silence, tears, or injustice, their kindness turned to lashes. In some places, the wedding night was a performance. Bedsheets checked, blood was glory, none was shame. Some families displayed the sheet in the yard like a victory flag. You couldn't wince, couldn't be embarrassed, couldn't panic. You could only smile, bow, and thank them for accepting you. As if your body wasn't yours, as if your whole life was to guard a membrane, and only if it tore at the right time, right way, right place, could you live on. In that society, you couldn't be experienced. You could only be ignorant. Naive, innocent, pure were praises. Worldly, choosing, loving were crimes. Each time you stepped outside the mold, did something for yourself, virgin or not, you were dirty. But if you died never straying from the limits, they called you decent. And that's the worst part, when your worth was tied to something biological, fragile, easily stolen, easily slandered, while your soul, mind, courage went unmentioned. You weren't a person. You were a glass jar holding others' pride, and when it cracked, they didn't fix it. They smashed you too. Freedom came only when you could be yourself, even if it bothered others. And sadly, in that era, being yourself was the last thing a girl dared dream of. But if you were lucky, not accused, not locked up, not poisoned, not forced to marry, not shaved, not bound, not buried under scornful stares, if you survived, then tell your daughter. Even if someone stops you, even if you were taught to stay silent, even if your whole life you didn't speak for fear of being called shrewd, rebellious, worthless, this time, speak. Because if you don't, your daughter will grow up as you did, not knowing why she must be silent, not knowing why her emotions are wrong, not knowing why stepping out the door means bowing her head, not knowing why what happens to her is her fault, and worst, not knowing why she must live without being allowed to exist. Tell her about what you were forbidden, the dress you couldn't wear, because bare shoulders are lewd, the hair you had to hide, because loose hair is provocative, the fear hearing a man's footsteps behind you, the sleepless nights dreading false rumors, with no way to defend yourself. Tell her you once believed virginity was your only worth, that you trembled in the village square just for refusing a proposal, that you locked away your dreams for fear they'd say. Girls shouldn't want to learn. Tell her of the deaths you saw, bloodless deaths, souls broken, women with empty eyes, mothers without laughter, girls bowing from age 5, those accused without names, those who loved at the wrong time and vanished, and those who did nothing, but were buried under the crowd's gaze. Then hold her hand, show her. You don't have to live like me. She can question, cry, rage, choose, refuse, love who she wants, love no one, be silent, speak out, wear red, blush cheeks, laugh loud, speak strong, refuse a husband she doesn't love, refuse children if unready, refuse to apologize for being herself. And if your daughter asks, why couldn't you live like that? Don't be ashamed. Don't say because I wasn't good. Don't say because I was weak. Tell the truth, because I wasn't allowed, because I lived in a time when girls were taught to survive, not live, where virtue was imposed, not chosen, where silence was the only insurance and the costliest price. Speak so your daughter knows she doesn't need to bow to anyone, doesn't need to starve to wear nice clothes, hold tears to save face, endure to be decent. Teach her that decency isn't in blood on bedsheets, in white wedding cloaks, in smiling while screaming inside. Decency starts with daring to say, "I can't take it anymore." And if someone tells your daughter to keep herself, be proper, stay silent to be loved, she'll know without trembling. No, I have the right to speak, because a mother dared to tell, refused to let silence kill another generation, refused to let moral dictums bury what needed naming. And in that, you, who were forced to be silent, opened a new path. In the Middle Ages, no one taught you this. They taught you to hide your hair, seal your mouth, birth in pain, bury sorrow with smiles. But you can be the first to teach your child to step into the light without apology. You don't need to rule her as they ruled you. Just hold her hand, walk beside her, and if you can, don't make her endure pain to live as you did. Because if anything remains after all you endured, it's hope that you survived, not just to live, but to speak, to pass on, to remind others that invisible things leave scars, that once, women had to keep themselves to death without knowing what they kept, for whom or why no one caught them when they fell. Tell it. Tell your daughter. Tell the daughters not yours. Because if you don't, the story will be told by others, those who never lived in your skin, never knew the fear of village eyes, never felt the weight of a yoke like breath on their neck, and they'll rewrite history as they did, that women of old were so gentle, so proper, so chaste, without mentioning the cost. So, if you're still alive, if you've walked through all 31 parts of the hell called virtue, if you've reached the final page of a book no one wrote for you, then write the next part for your child. Write with words, with hugs, with daring to live your life, because history isn't just carved in stone, it's carried in blood, and your blood still flows. And this time, let that blood not stain bedsheets, but become a voice, a life, a freedom, a story your daughter will carry on, not with tears, but with faith that my mother dared to tell. And because of that, I get to live as a person, not a shadow, not a commodity, not a jar to be inspected, but a person, truly, fully, free. The story why medieval chastity standards were brutal and impossible isn't just a portrait of the Middle Ages' cruelty to women. It's a mirror reflecting issues still simmering in American society today. We no longer shackle women in yokes or burn them for losing virginity, but double standards on gender morality, control over women's bodies, and victim-blaming culture persist in modern forms, slut-shaming on social media, judging outfits, dismissing post-rape depression, and pressuring girls to behave properly, while boys are free to explore. In the story, a girl was beaten to death over a glance, a mother isolated for not dying with her husband, a child denied care because he was that woman's son, all reflecting a principle: when society values communal honor over individual lives, justice cannot exist. In America today, the lesson is clear. We must keep speaking out, educating, and changing how women are treated, from family to school to legal systems. Teach daughters their worth isn't in their body's state, but in their character and self-determination. Teach sons to respect boundaries, consent, and emotional language. And above all, let women tell their own stories. As part 32 concluded, if you're still alive, tell your daughter. The story doesn't end in darkness, but in the light of understanding, sharing, and courage to step out of silence. If you believe women deserve to be heard, to live true, and not apologize for themselves, subscribe to join us in telling the stories hidden in history. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. See you in the next video to keep unveiling truths never spoken aloud.